What did we do before phones? I mean, what did we do with ourselves before things started? But everybody's on their phone, right?
We sat down and talked to each other.
We used to talk to each other. Isn't that amazing? That'll be one of the strategies for leveraging the skills of diversity teams. Speak to each other. So I'm going to make you guys work for this, okay? This is, you're going to have to do some work because it's a workshop. So I'm going to start with some fun, and that is, what issues arise when you get different people together and try to get them to work together?
People make assumptions, so there's incorrect information.
You said two things, right? Incorrect assumptions
Yes.
and incorrect information, right?
Yeah.
What else?
Different focus, so like different focus. So like even if the goal is overall the same, like each team has their own like this is my success.
So different focus and different like objectives?
Yeah, different objectives.
Okay.
No time, everybody's busy.
Lack of a common language to describe either certain features or things like that.
Okay.
Like lack of a glossary or vernacular.
Even though they may be actually
They don't
speaking the
always
same
mean the same
language,
thing. Don't always mean
like
the same thing.
English or French, or they still are not,
Right.
you're missing each other, okay.
Working styles. Some people, they like to talk, others they prefer to draw or
Can I piggyback off that and say processing styles too? Learning styles, yeah.
I'll contend that processing and learning are two different styles, right? They're
I think a vague understanding of responsibilities.
Say it again.
People don't understand, people view their area of responsibilities in some way, and sometimes there are some aspects that everybody thinks that someone else will do.
Oh, that someone else is responsible for, so it's really who's responsible for what?
Yeah.
Or maybe who gets to decide, right?
Yeah.
And in that responsibility, it means you're making some decisions, right? So maybe it's different scopes. Different scopes of responsibility? Or is it different areas?
I think it's just lack of understanding of roles and responsibilities. Roles and responsibilities.
bias. There's some people that have some bias. Like I'm biased because I'm assuming you're from sales, so you don't know anything technically or the way around.
Okay.
I think related egos is a problem. Like people have their own opinion and they're stuck with that, and then someone else has a different opinion, and just because it's my idea.
So inability to see other people's
yeah, exactly.
opinions.
Yeah.
Any more? So what do you think underlies all these things? I mean, this is what shows up in the workplace, right? Or at home or anywhere, right? This is how it shows up. What do you think is behind all this?
Communication, I would say.
Communication?
Lack of communication.
Yeah.
Lack of communication, okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
What else?
Some past history working together, so if you know the people and better, I guess you can work with them more effectively.
So you kind of know where they're coming from,
Yes.
right? You know why they say things, or maybe you just know their personality and they're prone to throwing out new ideas at random. I'm gonna call that knowledge of how others are, right? Because you have some history. What else?
Different goals. Different goals.
Different goals?
Yeah.
Different culture.
Different cultures?
Individualistic versus community-oriented, competitive versus cooperative. Cultures that say one or the other.
And you said competitive versus?
I mean, I was just throwing out.
No, but this is good because it is making people think, right? Because we're all in our own boxes, right? So-
Right, I was thinking competitive versus cooperative,
Versus cooperative, okay.
and then realized I was setting those up as opposing.
They can be,
Well, but even just I was thinking of opposing.
right? If you're an opposite, they're going in opposite directions. What else do you think is
I
behind
think
it?
I read recently, like, early risers versus night owls. Like, if it is a
Okay,
meeting at 8
okay,
a.m.,
okay.
someone needs coffee before they can engage, and others are already hyperactive.
And even a lot of these can be characterized as country cultures, right? So if you pit, Germany against France, the Germans are, the meeting's at 9 o'clock, they're there at 9 o'clock, and the French show up 2 hours later, right? So it's like, really? And in both cultures, it's okay, you're doing what's okay in your culture, but when you switch, it's different. It's very different. Any more that come to mind?
One thing there I see that quite often is as well different time zones. So my 8 a.m. could be at 10 p.m. for someone
Yes,
else. So
yes, and that makes a huge difference, particularly when you're trying to get multiple time zones to meet. There's somebody who's on the phone at 2 a.m. Right? No, I'm not doing a video conference at 2 a.m. I don't care what you say. I'm doing this with my bunny slippers, Great. Any more?
Idea of the black and white, like, because we have like a lot of like, you're either this or that, you're an individualist or you're a community or you're competitive, you're early riser or late nighter, kind of like the idea of meeting in the middle or being on the spectrum between like the opposite extremes.
It isn't one or the other.
It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right.
So, but part of what you're saying then is we might try to put people into buckets, but we might be incorrect, right? Because they're this way, then they're also going to be this way, right?
I don't know if it's like a way of being, more like being able to adjust. Like,
Okay, so
you know
it's
what,
flexibility.
I'm a morning person. I'd rather do it in the morning, but if I do a meeting in the morning, you're doing it at 2 in the morning. So, okay, fine, I'll move my meeting a little bit back. It doesn't, that's like a really simplistic example.
compromise.
Like,
So it's the flexibility or compromisability, is that a word?
flexibility. Yeah.
Any more? There is more, okay.
A lot of times, like face-to-face communication, either you work remotely or people in different countries, so you don't have that kind of opportunity to meet as a group to talk about.
And that's happening more and more, isn't it? That you're not getting that face-to-face. So I'm going to say lacking face-to-face, because that's the, right? You don't get the, you don't really get the full picture. You don't get somebody going, you want to what? It doesn't always.
It's hard to gauge.
It's hard to gauge,
what
right?
people
Is
say.
it a fix or not? Somebody back, I think you had one.
Yes, I'm just wondering how we're defining diverse teams.
However you want to define it, right? I mean, it's cultural, it's men and women, it's how we think, how we process, it's all these things. Really, because even if people look the same, what goes on in here is not the same, right? I mean, what goes on in here is really a product of your DNA, right? There's some parts that you were born with it, right? But a lot of it is all the experiences, your cumulative experiences in life, right? So you find somebody that was born in the U.S. and grew up in one city, and I actually know people who, haven't traveled more than 3 hours from their house, right? Very different than somebody that started out as a kid traveling in different countries and learning about different cultures. They have a very different outlook in life, right? So you can't even, the packaging doesn't tell you what goes on inside, right? This is maybe it's false advertising, right? We're not packaged right, so we don't have a label so people can read us.
Just when I think of skills of diverse teams, I will go with the workshop and get something out. It's just, when I think of strategies for leveraging the skills of diverse teams, given the things that I've heard so far, I'm just wondering how people are defining diversity, but you're saying it can be any differences, but that's any team.
That's right. Well, that's
All
not
teams are
totally
diverse,
right.
yeah,
You will look, if you look at some teams, you will see that they are not diverse. And that comes from the fact that people tend to hire people that are like them.
Correct.
So you end up with this whole team of people that are like me, right? And it's actually very dangerous because that team is much more likely to get into this group think and to reject new information that's coming in that could be what they need to do to change their business, to change their product, to change their whatever it is, right? But they reject it because they all look at each other and go, should we pay attention to this? They all go, no, that's not the stuff that we need to deal with, right? And so diversity is very important to have on your teams because it's people who think differently, who process information differently, are the most likely people who are going to go out and really get you more innovation, right?
Just a comment to me, it's more about the personality. Like, there's all this personality test, I think, in some of them. And a diverse team for me is a team where the personalities are different. Like some are extroverts,
Yes.
some are introverts, some are...
And you can't necessarily tell that, like I said, from the package,
Right.
right? You two could actually think very much alike, right? But I wouldn't know it from looking at you, right? I wouldn't. So so part of diversity lies in people's heads. But I mean, I worked for GE for a long time, and you could open up their annual report, and apparently all their executives are tall, skinny white guys. Okay, I mean it was like, copy paste, and they're getting better, right? But that's the group that all tends to think alike. You hire people who've had the same experiences as you, and you end up with this, everybody's the same, but you miss a lot when you do that. You miss a whole lot. And now what we have here, particularly in Silicon Valley, is we have a lot of very, very diverse teams. But if they don't talk to each other, if they can't relate to each other, if they can't communicate to each other, if they don't have a language where they can talk about the differences out in the open, then those things become things that people make assumptions about, right? People assume it's one way or the other, and that colors their whole interaction with people, right? And that can be that can be even more deadly, I think, right? Because then the diversity is there, but you're not able to leverage it, and it becomes something where people bang into each other. So I'm sure none of you work at companies that have silos inside their companies, right? Nobody has any, right, everybody's open, we all communicate together. But a lot of those silos come from that, this is our realm and we're keeping it and we're keeping everybody else out and this is what we want to control. And that can really lead them to a downfall because the next new thing might be in what they control, but they choose to do nothing with it until a competitor comes up and stomps them, right? I mean, that happens a lot, right? Wasn't it Kodak, right? They came up with their first digital camera. They presented it to the executive team. And they said, people want to share photos. They want to, mail them to you and put it up on your bulletin board and do all that stuff. We don't need this. Right? And where are they now? DOA, right? They're gone. They went out of business, right? So that's what we're trying to prevent, right? How do you get people to do that? So the objectives of this session are really to get an awareness and an understanding of how this goes together. I'm not going to fix it here, okay? It's going to take a little more than an hour. I mean, companies have been working on this forever, right? And they still don't have it right, right? And that disturbs me greatly. So, but we're going to develop a few skills to really look at for our own selves what's happening in our mind and what assumptions we're making so that you will approach the world a little bit differently. And I'm going to characterize some things. So what I'm going to do in this workshop is I'm going to take, what's one primary difference between everybody in this room?
One primary? Oh, wrong story. It's all different.
Men and women?
Oh, okay.
Right? Men and women? Right? That's one, we can kind of bifurcate this room by two things, men and women, right? And I'm going to use that as an example. But as I'm going through this example, I want you to think it could be cultures. It could be business philosophies. I worked in one company where cooperation was the culture. And I worked at another company where clobbering the other team was the culture, right? And the behaviors are quite a bit, and the thinking is quite a bit different, right? I mean, let me tell you, that was a bizarre transition to go from one to the other, right? But I'm going to use men and women as an example so that you can see it, because I think you'll see some of these things. But think bigger than just men and women, right? Because it comes from a lot more than that. Okay, we did those. So there's a continuum, I think somebody said that. There's kind of a continuum of how people are. And I'm going to peg women on one side and men on the other. Not that they are actually that way, okay? And there's a chart later on, but you kind of really see two bell curves, right? And like, I've been in tech my whole life. And so if you gave me a lot of these personality tests and these kinds of things, I would squarely be on the male side for many, many aspects, right? Because that's how I was raised, if you will, right? From an experience standpoint. So I behave a lot like a man. But in some aspects of my life, I'll do a flip, and I won't. And you'll never know where I'm going to be unless when you get to know me, then you'll kind of know, but you won't know. And that's the thing, is we don't have any, radio frequency devices where you can sense where people are. So when you look at problem solving, right? Oh, there's a problem, we got to go solve it. What we find is that men think and act very quickly. They are fact-based. What are the facts? Tell me what happened. Give me an example. They use stepwise thinking. A to B, B to C, C to D, right? And they focus on the goal. Our goal is to solve this problem. We're not solving world hunger. We're not doing this. We're not doing this. They focus right in and get at a problem. And in doing that, they tend to eliminate a lot of things around the problem. Women, on the other hand, and you'll see there's some real opposites here, expand the context. So they want to look at the bigger picture, and they'll say, you know, if A, then B, C, or D could happen, and that could lead to EQ, FR, GP, right? It goes on and on and on. And if you compare those two, right, men thinking and acting and women expanding the context, you see they're going in opposite directions, right? So problem-solving meetings can be very entertaining with men and women, right? Because it appears they're going in different directions. Women get more expansive in the number of causes they consider, you know? So, you know, a guy might look at something and say, oh, that's it. That's the problem right there. And women go, wait, let's look and see if it could be anything else. And they start to look, and the men are like, no, it's this. You can see that it's this. What's wrong with you? Why are you doing that, right? And you see that that is starting to lead to conflict. So it's very, and this is how our brains are wired. You know, we don't decide to be this way, right? This is kind of how our brains are wired. Women tend to explore multiple options. Men will tend to hone in on one and say, let's go for it. Women may end up with a more enduring solution, meaning that they may have factored in other things that are secondary causes, and they will factor those into their solution. If we do this, then what about this, this, and this, right? We should look at this bigger picture. So when we're problem solving, people can be on different ends of the spectrum. Let's look at when we make decisions, right? Because that's another activity that happens a lot at work. Men tend to isolate issues and just look at that issue and not look at anything that might be connected to that issue. And women can kind of think more fully through things, but it takes longer, right? Because it's more, they consider more stuff in their thinking. Men will start with a number of causes and then whack a bunch out. That's not it, right? And women use this intuitive, and it drives men crazy, by the way. Right? Well, I think we really ought to consider this. And I can't tell you how many guys I've said something like that to, and they go, where did that come from? What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. Women tend to think multidimensionally, right? They're not limited by this. And if you're in a relationship with someone, you know, and you're trying to make a decision, you know, you got a guy who says, let's just go do this. Let's go out to dinner. He says, oh, let's go here. And she says, well, let's see, what do you feel like eating? And do you want to have a drink or not? And do you want to go out for ice cream afterwards? And he's like, for crying out loud, I'm just trying to figure out where to go to dinner, and you're talking about what we're doing after dinner. Well, she's trying to find a restaurant that's near the ice cream shop, because that's what she wants, right? And he's just going, why can't we just decide where we're going to eat? Well, because it might be on the other side of town. Right? So it's a very bizarre conversation.
Can you kind of summarize what you're saying is, women, it's much more, a priority is the process of how you get there, and then it's just the decision.
Yes, in fact, that's very true. So men tend to credit themselves when they get the decision and have a result. Women, on the other hand, the result is important, but how you got there is also important. Whether you enhanced relationships or destroyed relationships along the way, you could arrive at the exact same decision, but if you destroyed relationships on the way for a woman, you failed. Right? Even though you arrived at the same place, right? For men, that relationships might not be important, right? So it's a very different focus, and you must have seen my slide deck.
Personal.
You've been studying ahead of time. So feel appreciation. Now this one always cracks me up, because this goes in, and think about it as we talk about this, the relationship between an employee and their boss. Okay, because you know employees always want to feel appreciated, or even how you as a product manager appreciate your team, right? So men like to be singled out for a task. Can you do this? Oh, yes, I can do that. Women want to be part of a team. So they don't want to be the only one out, right? They don't necessarily want to be the hero. Men, when they start a project, tend to want to work by themselves. And when you let them do that, it's a sign that you trust them and you have confidence in their ability. Women want support, and they also want to talk about it. They get their information through talking. Men process themselves internally. Women process by talking. So if you ever wonder why women talk so much, it's how they process information in their head, right? So they're both doing the same thing, but it shows up very differently. And it's very opposite, right? I mean, they're very opposite. So you can see, you know, how a man would appreciate a woman and how a woman would appreciate a man. Some of the things you do are like actually not, they're not appreciative, right? They don't fit the thing. Men don't like to be asked questions. Just let me do my job and get the results that I need. Women process and collaborate by talking about things. So a woman will come in and say, well, you know, I was thinking about this project and I was thinking that we should do this and this and this. And you look at me and you go, I'm trying to think about this. Could you get out of my face? Right? Because that's how I need to process by myself, and then I'm ready to talk to you. But women are exactly the opposite, right? So they want to talk about it, and then they go process it, but they collect their input by talking about it. Men collect their input by thinking about it on their own. Men like to show their ability, and they kind of like to outdo their rivals. There's a little one-upmanship. You know, I can come up with a better idea than you can come up with. Where women really like to participate and build on other people's ideas, right? And say, oh, we take 2 things from her and 1 from him, and look what we got. Isn't that really cool? Right? So they're more building. Men like to be acknowledged and rewarded for their results, and women like to be recognized for the, you know, what happened along the journey to get to the results, which is to your point, right? It's a part of how they put all these things together. So they're very different. Now I have to go back and characterize, talk about this leadership continuum a little bit. So I've characterized men and women as kind of polar opposites, but that's not true, right? We know that. So I can be a woman who's all the way over here, right? So I could behave like a man, right? And you could be a man who's way over here, right? That behaves like a woman. And on one issue, I might behave like a man because it was something that came through my culture and my experience and my upbringing. And on another issue, I can behave totally like a woman, right? So you can't just look at somebody and say they're going to behave this way, because everybody's kind of on a spectrum and a continuum in the whole package. And so you can't tell. You have to have a conversation about it. And that's what makes this particularly hard. And as you look through all this stuff, you know, there's a lot of items up here that involve communication. And is this stuff we talk about at work? You guys talk about these things at work? So what happens is we get into conflict with some of these things, right? So let's say I'm in a meeting and I bring up an idea. This is very typical. I bring up an idea and it's completely ignored. And then Joe, over here, brings up the same idea 5 minutes later. And everybody's, oh, what a great idea. Now I'm going to walk out of this meeting and I'm going to talk to my friend, right? It'll probably be a girlfriend. And say, did you see what that jerk did? What have I done? I have put malintent on poor Joe. Right? In reality, when Joe walks out of that room, he's probably going, wow, we came up with a great, you know, whatever it is. He has no idea he's offended me. He has no idea I'm upset. But I've already put intent. He intended to do that to me, right? That was his purpose. When he was just trying to, you know, he's doing the best that he can with what he's got, right? So now I put bad intent. Same, that you can do the flip side with women, right? I mean, it's the same. Why would she do that, right? Why on earth would she do that? And so it's one thing to make an assumption, and then it's another thing to put bad intent from another person on that. And that's where the friction usually comes in the workplace, and that's where things tend to, you know, make loud banging noises, right? Because that's where things go south. And then, of course, the more they bang into each other, the worse it gets, right? And that's how we get, I think, into a lot of this lawsuit thing that goes around, right? I mean, a lot of this is I think, spurned by not understanding and then putting bad intent. You intended to hurt me. When in reality, most of us do not get up in the morning and go, who can I hurt today? Who can I punch out today? So that's not what we do on our way to work, and think about that. So it's important that we understand, and when you do it, to stop doing it, right? I'm going to give you a little example. So if you look at information absorption, there's a lot of different things that how we communicate, right? And I think you talked about face-to-face communications, right? And like over the phone and things, you really lose a lot of information in that, right? I think you have like, I don't know, it's less than 20% of the information, right? A lot of information comes to you non-verbally, which you don't get when you're on the phone. Or it's even worse when you're in email, right? I have in my career on several occasions had to get up from my desk and go walk into somebody's office and say, you will not send another email on this topic. You will get up and go talk to that person because they start a war, right? And then they put bad intent. Oh, she's just trying to look good in front of the boss. I'm going to get her, right? And it escalates into a war, and there's really no reason for it, right? I mean, that isn't. Neither one of these people said, I'm going to get in a fight with Diana today, right? That's not what we do, right? But we assume that other people are doing it to us, which always kind of cracks me up. So if you look at information absorption, and I'm going to talk about men and women, but I'm going to talk about two contexts, right? There's low context and high context. This is something that came from Hall's study of social environments. This is like back in the 60s when he did these studies. So some people absorb only certain information, right? And this is part of what guys can typically look at, right? They look at an individual spectrum and they don't look at the other things. Women, on the other hand, tend to look at more. By the way, that drives guys crazy, right? Because they're like, why are you talking about this stuff? It has nothing to do with what we're trying to decide. Cut it out. And what you get is a disconnect between what people are seeing. And you get a disconnect, and you got to think about this as a lens. We all have lenses in our eyeballs, right? Or some people have extra lenses, right? So you have a lens on how you look at the world. And when you look at the world through your lens, it doesn't look the same as it looks through other people's lens. And you can really see this when you watch a little kid skip down the street just because they're happy. How often do you skip down the street? As adults, we've lost our ability to skip down the street because it's just fun. Okay, I have a 10-year-old, and he's just a great skipper. And I always know when he's happy because that's what he does, right? He skips, right? But, adults don't. And so you look at that and you go, what are you doing? Well, he's just happy. He's just exhibiting his happiness, right? So you have a lens and you carry it around, but you don't know you've got it. So one of the things that we can do is we can talk about, why did you say that? Are you making an assumption there? I'm not sure what you've assumed in order to get to that position. So there are a lot of things we can talk about to kind of try to identify what lens is somebody looking through in order to understand where they're coming from. So women are frequently accused in meetings of bringing up things that are outside the scope of the discussion. So she's nodding. Does that happen to you? And you're like, why are you talking about that? But see, we don't ask that. We just ignore that person. Or we say, that's irrelevant. That's outside the scope of this decision. When in reality, if somebody brings up something totally off the wall that you think is off the wall, you say, help me understand, why did you bring that up? And they will probably draw a path from where you understood the decision to be, and they will say, well, if we add this feature, and we ship this product to China, and this happens, then these people will not want the product. But all they brought up was, these people over here, and you can't always connect where somebody has passed through, right? And so when you hear this off-the-wall information, think about it and ask a question and say, why did you bring that up? Help me understand why you brought that up, because I think it might be important, but I don't understand the full context, right? So that is one really helpful tip is to ask about it. And these are the questions we almost never ask, right? Things just fall to the floor. This next slide is one of the ones I really enjoy. Men feel imprisoned when they have to share information. Right? Is this true for the guys in the room? If you had to cough up everything about the project that you were working on, how would that make you feel? It's a waste of your time, isn't it?
Or I could be replaced, and it's a knowledge transfer.
So it is threatening.
Yeah.
Knowledge is a weapon.
When do women feel imprisoned?
I mean, if it's just based on the opposite, then it's like when they're not allowed to talk about something.
When they're left out of the information room. Are those not like diametrically opposite? So some people like keep close control of the information, and what you're doing is disenfranchising the women, right? But if you're a woman and you're like, tell me all about your project, the guys are like running for the door. It's like, no, please God, don't make me do that. I can't stand it anymore, right? It's torture. It's literal torture, right? So the ways that we are inherently conflict. And you might say, well, just forget it. We'll have guys work over here and women work over here. But it's in the diversity of thought, in the diversity of how we value things, in the diversity of relationships. That's where we get a lot of innovation. That's where we get the creativity. That's where all this stuff comes from. But we have to work together in order to make this happen. Isn't that scary? And one of the things that I think you'll see more and more of is companies pushing forward and educating people on these kinds of differences so that you're aware that they're there, and so that when you have an interaction, you can go, oh, wait, you discounted what she said, but I want to hear why she said it, right? Because there might be something really important there for us. But that takes time, right? That takes more time. So, what you need, right, is education about differences so that you understand where these differences come from. And with each person, it's different. In companies, you need to create a language and a culture where the differences are talked about, right? And they're appreciated, right? I don't want my whole team thinking the same way. I want them thinking different, even though that will bring conflict into the team. They need to work through that and talk about it and decide where they want to do. Because what we're doing is we go to this model, right, where we just make assumptions. We don't talk about it and we keep, cruising forward. And then sometimes those things blow up behind us, right? Our assumptions were wrong, right? I mean, Kodak's assumptions were wrong, right? They created the digital camera and then they shelved it. And we need to learn to value these differences so that we can start to leverage the skills on the team. Because what happens when you don't value other people is they shut down. And when you look at the statistics, and these statistics have been this way for 30 years or so, about 20% of the workforce is engaged. Meaning they're going to stand up and say, no, that's not right. This is not how we do things. They're really moving forward. And 80% of the workforce is disengaged. Yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? Who do you want on your team? The engaged or the disengaged? I think you want the engaged people on the team, but it's going to take a little work in order to get there. So, questions? Comments? Go for it.
So I think, I mean, the men and women thing is good. I also see, you can't just say, oh, men are this way and women are this way, because
They're
maybe
not.
in your own experience, women have formed into a certain way to be able to run teams. Take, for example, a female program manager, right, working with mostly men and driving them, right, along programs. I've been like complete opposite of your couple last slides, where it was like a role reversal. It's like, okay, you don't want to share information, I'm out of the loop. So I think you have to kind of look at differences in general and not tag differences to people.
The only reason I do this is because a lot of people see it in
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
They say, oh, I am that way.
Yeah.
How did you know? Right?
Yeah.
But I caution you not to say women are like this and men are like, because they really aren't. You know, we're all on a spectrum, and for different issues, you know, we'll flip flop on that spectrum, right? I mean, I'm a mechanical engineer and I have an MBA and I'm all these technical people, and then people are always shocked when they find out I love to knit. Right? I mean, they're kind of like, oh, I would never have guessed that you did that. So, well, hey, I gotta do something for my sanity, right? So you should never make assumptions, and that's the hardest part, is you have to figure out where people are coming from and create a language to talk about it. Other questions? Thoughts, confusions?
Maybe in the thoughts category, I do recognize this when, like, me being more stereotypical man in your example in meetings, for example, and these off-the-wall ideas. This drives me completely nuts, because the meeting will, if you follow all these threads, the meeting will never end. So that's my biggest concern with, and why so it's basically because of time. I don't want to discuss it.
So a couple of tips, okay? If you've got an absolutely urgent problem that's got to be solved tomorrow, put men in the room. If you've got a problem that you really want a holistic solution that's going to last for a long time, get a mixed team in the room, right? Because it takes longer. The way women process information and how they value things, it's not just the end result, it's how we got there, and did we preserve our relationships, and have we added new relationships, and right? It's a very different dynamic, and so you may need to look at your teams and say, what is the end goal that we're trying to get to, and what's more important, right? Speed or the quality of the solution we come up with. Right? You kind of have to weigh that in, and there may be cases where speed is of absolute critical importance, right? But there may be a lot of other cases where it's not, and so you have to say, this may take longer than we'd like it to, but we really want a more holistic solution that's going to last for a while. I mean, that's what we need for this. So you may have to really look at that and see where you are.
You could do both, right? I mean,
You might do both.
Yeah.
But then you have to be careful. I worked for one company, and it absolutely cracked me up. They did this because it was like bizarre. So they would take two teams to develop the same product. They put them on opposite sides of the campus. They wouldn't tell them about each other. And they'd have them go to work, right? And of course, do you think the teams found out about each other? Of course they did. And then what they found out is the guys were going into each other's labs, right? This is one of those where you got to play in the lab. And they were sabotaging each other's experiments and tests and equipment, because they had set up a culture where, one of these teams is going to win, the other one's going to get laid off. So they really amped up the stakes, right? But they indoctrinated their entire leadership team. They all grew up through this process. Do you think you could stand around with your back to people in this company? No, somebody would put a knife in it, right? I came into this company, it was like the first year, I was like, wow, this is bizarre. Because you'd watch a manager come and they'd say, okay, new manager's in here. And employees would actually leave instantly. and go work somewhere else, aren't you even gonna see how this guy could work out? No, I already know how he's gonna work out, it's not gonna work for me, and I'm out of here, right? Boom! I mean, it was like, what, I mean, he's only been here 4 days, aren't you gonna give him a chance? Nope. Because the stakes were too high, right? And that's a piece that you have to factor in, right?
My daughter is a third year in college, and she tells me about the sabotage attempts that go on, amongst her fellow students. They'll rip pages out of a book that they're supposed to reference, or they'll intentionally pass out, wrong information as they try to compete each other for the best GPA.
Well, and that's when, when you set up we want a competitive culture internally, right? I mean, I looked at this company and I said, what if we took all the time and energy that people spend trying to kill each other internally, and we focused on customer needs? There's a tremendous amount of hours and time and energy, and if you put all that into understanding what customers really wanted, I hazard to say that they would have made a whole lot more money, right?
Right.
Because they were, so the company culture, I mean, there's people's personal culture, right? But there's also kind of the company culture. How are you with the company culture? And if you've got a culture that's doing that, I mean, you're disenfranchising your people. You're disabling them. It's like, okay, come to work. I want you to roller skate, but I'm going to tie one leg up. You're going to roller skate on one leg. It's like, well, this is kind of hard, It would be a lot easier if I could use both my legs, It's like, no, we can't do that here. So you have to, company culture can be really important. And sometimes executives do not see the result of rules and things that they impose, right? And sometimes you got to go back in and say that you're doing this and it's resulting in this. Is that really what you intended? And usually the answer is no, that isn't what we wanted to do.
Yeah, they may never know. I mean, you got that top down to the middle manager, and then the middle manager down to the, the individual worker, and typically don't hear from the bottom up. I've been in a couple of industries. In the military, we had cross-cultural communications, and so we had security partners in NATO and in Asian countries, and so we had to learn about how they deal with what their thought processes are. And then in high tech, we have the same kind of multinational corporation setup where we're dealing with development efforts in India and maybe a global headquarters in the UK. And so, we're talking English, between India, England, and the US, but we're not on the same, vocabulary like some of us have already.
Well, and even when the vocabulary is the same, sometimes it's things you can't see. So Gerber, the one who makes the little baby food jars, right?
Yeah.
Gerber baby food, right? So they went into Africa. And they used the same labeling that they used here in the US, right? They put their food out. Nobody bought it. Well, crap, you put a little white baby on it. What's wrong with you? Right? So they put a little black baby on it. People still didn't buy it. They're like, what is going on with this? In Africa, the picture is what's in the container. Okay, so it was all there. They could have seen it, but they misinterpreted what they should be doing. And I mean, that's gross, isn't it? It's like, oh God, how can we do that, right? So, then they changed it so there's carrots on the label, right? And boom, sales took off. Like, why wouldn't these people want this ready-to-use product? You don't have to fix it. You don't have to prepare anything. It's right out of the jar. You can eat it, right? Well, because they didn't know it was carrots, right? So it's right there. Like you said, it's all in English, but we didn't interpret it right. And that's where we go south a lot of times with this. Other questions?
One thing I guess is when you hear about Silicon Valley's problem of diversity, everyone talks, yeah, it needs to be more diverse. But for example, this is a conference of product managers, and the attendance I was expecting was going to be like, this is a big problem, no one knows how to solve it. And I guess people say, yeah, there's a problem, but there is no actual work being done. I don't know what can it be done to drive or get these more, I guess, people focusing on how to deal with this issue. And
There's a lot of work being done. The problem with this work, and I work with, well, this says consult Cornwell, I work with the Gender Intelligence Group, which talks about these things, and there are a lot of, okay, we'll have a women's group, we'll have an African American group, we'll have all these employee resource groups is what they call them, and that will fix our problem. Well, you know what? It doesn't address any of this stuff, right? Because you don't educate people about the differences so that when they see them, they stop and ask the question. And unfortunately, I'll tell you, you have to have leadership at the top engaged from the very beginning. And when the leadership at the top decides that's how they're going to run the company, then changes start to happen, right? And we've seen phenomenal results, right? One company that we went into, they went in and they did a bunch of workshops and they trained people and stuff. And this was not a selling feature at the time, but one of the executives came in and said, you know, 8 months after we did all this training, all our silos disappeared. People started communicating across those silos and figured out that it was in their best interest to work together instead of, you know, I'm protecting my stuff and you're protecting your stuff, right? And so big changes can happen, but the leadership has to be committed to it as a business imperative.
I guess, I don't know, is it easier for them to commit if they do these kind of workshops, or because I guess you need to convince them. I don't know what's
They have to believe that it's a problem they have to solve. And once executives think that's a problem to solve, then they'll do it. But a lot of the things that they've done, like unconscious bias training, and there's, you know, a whole wave of things that have gone through have been, let me say, window dressing on the issue.
And I guess probably it would help starting with a diverse leadership team, no? So
Well, and if you don't start with a diverse leadership team, by the way, they look at you and go,
I guess
what problem? We don't have a problem. As long as we see the world through our own lenses, there's no problem at all. The problem is, you know, the other people who are diverse are seeing a very different picture.
So perhaps the sponsor can be the most kind of diverse, or the one that is not the average.
Frequently that happens,
Okay.
but you know, there is big money at stake here, right?
I see this in many ways, not biased, but like me being European, and say, well, American companies, you could say, oh yeah, they're designing a product, but it's 20% of the market share, and they're selling 80% across the world. So it's very important to understand how to sell
To the rest of it,
Yeah,
to
like
the other
80%,
80%.
the Africa and all those.
Right, yeah, you don't want to
It's a
put
challenge.
those babies on the label, can be very dangerous. You know,
You
it's
can
like,
see
oh.
over and over stories like that.
Well, and that's, you know, that's where if you have diverse, so we have two problems here, although here in Silicon Valley, we tend to have a lot of diversity, right? But I don't know that it's really integrated, right? So what happens is you get, you know, some percentage of the company that's making all the decisions and the other percentage of the company that checks out. I mean, they just kind of mentally, I mean, they go to work, they do their thing, but they're not the ones who are going to say, now, wait a minute. I don't think that's what we should do. You know, somebody says, we should do this. And they're like, yeah, whatever. Okay, whatever. It's your company. But that's when it's your company. It's not my company then, right? It's somebody else's. So you're not engaged. And when you're not engaged, you're disenfranchised. And, you know, you walk down this path where it's like, well, who cares? You know, I'll be home in 2 hours and I can have a beer. It doesn't matter, right?
Do you think many of these problems are caused by internal competition within the company? So, for example, does it relate to personal bonuses versus team bonuses?
Absolutely.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge contributing factor in terms of how people are judged. But the other thing is, there's a whole lot more than what I presented here, because, you know, I didn't have like 3 weeks. I only had an hour. So it's your financial structure, but it's also how do you award people, right? How do you reward them? So you just saw, right? I could go reward all the men on the team with all the things that I like, and it would be torture for them, right? So I just really didn't reward them, right? I kind of spanked them almost and I thought I rewarded them, right? So when people see these differences, and I had one guy on my team, and I said, you know, you won this contract, and we'd like to do a special award presentation, and he literally ran from the room. He's like, no, because personally to him, that it wasn't his, you know, he was an introvert, he didn't want to be pointed out, he, you know, everything that I was trying to set up was the antithesis of what he personally needed, right? So, I mean, I gave him the award, you know, just me and him, and we published a small little article in the paper, you know, but I really had to play it down from what I would have done because it was just not what he wanted, right? So there's a lot of places you can get conflict. I mean, you can look at job descriptions, right? We want a team player who, you know, brings everybody in, blah, blah, blah. We want a go-getter who will stomp the competition, who will, you know, so those two wordings read quite a bit differently. And so there are a lot of people, it's like, well, I don't really want to stomp people. That's, you know, that's not what I want to do with my life, right? But, and the people who wrote them, you know, earnestly, that's how they think and that's what they wrote, but they don't realize they're turning off a huge section of the population by putting a description that's out there. And maybe they really needed a softer touch, right? I mean, maybe they really didn't need all that in order to get the job done. So there's a lot of internal things that are set up in companies that drive the culture that we should really look at and say, is that what we want? But it's really hard when, you know, you're releasing new products and you're trying to do this and you're trying to do that, and somebody comes in and says, let's talk about gender differences. They're like, that's not going to make us any money, go away, right? But in reality, there's a lot of money that they're actually losing, right? When you look at the churn, you know, the whole thing, there's not enough technical women. 50% of women who get a technical degree leave the industry that they started working in within 10 years because they don't feel appreciated. For years we said, oh, they're doing the mommy thing, or they found something else, or because women won't tell you that, right? As a boss, they would never say, you know, you guys treat me like crap, so I'm leaving. That's not, you know, you don't want to cut that bridge off, right? So it's like, I'm leaving for personal reasons, right? But that lack of honesty, you know, they're like, oh, well, women just don't want to be here. Well, that's not really true, right? There's a lot of reasons why they don't want to be there. So I spent 30 years in tech, so I think I've seen it all. I shouldn't say that because I'm sure there's something I haven't seen that I don't want to see, right? But you disenfranchise part of your employees, and then, you know, you're left with, you're not dealing with a full deck of cards, right? And you can do so much better, right? And you know what's amazing? I mean, yeah, the workshops and things, those things cost money. But once you get people engaged and they start this, one, I don't think you can turn it off, right? I mean, I guess if you hired a whole new leadership team, you could kill it off, right? So it's like self-perpetuating, right? And then it also attracts, right, new talent and more diverse talent, and things keep rolling, right? So it's really cool that it's kind of its own tornado that starts to spin in a positive way in terms of making money for the business.
One question, are there any specific companies that are leading, that are ahead of the pack, and it's obvious, or not really?
You know, there actually are some companies, there are some, interestingly enough, some financial companies, right, that began to realize that they really had to change. And some of the consulting companies, the Accentures, all those, you know, that come in and do business strategy and stuff, they had a huge problem with women. And they've done a lot of this work and workshops and understanding and they've made phenomenal results in terms of how they treat women, and now they've got much better retention. And so they've made a huge leap upward because they said this is important to us, right? But until the CEO says this is important to us and we're going to do it, it is an imperative, it usually doesn't happen. You have to have commitment from the top, because they model the behavior. And, you know, and they're also the ones as it peels down the layers, right? Because it's a layer thing, right? You know, and it's like that kindergarten game, you know, you whisper in somebody's ear, you go around the whole room, and what comes out the other side bears no resemblance to what you whispered in the first ear. So it plays out very differently, but companies that have really focused on that have made huge strides, which is really encouraging. It says you can do it. It's not impossible, you can do it, right? But you have to do the right things, and unfortunately there's a lot of, you know, we spent many years fixing women so that they would behave like men, right? I mean, we all remember the shoulder pads, right? The
And
shoulder
bow
pads,
ties.
right, and the jackets and stuff. And, you know, there's a lot of things that we did to say, you know, if women just behave like men, the world would certainly be a lot better. But now you're making women behave in a way that's not natural to them. And you can do that for a while, but after a while you get pissed off. You know, you're like, well, why do I have to be the one who flexes all the time, right? And I'm now operating in a mode that's not me. So we need to let people operate in a mode that's them, right? Because that's where the creativity comes in. That's where the innovation comes in, right? But we try to want to put people in little boxes, and we have to learn to stop doing that.
I guess it's like shipping product. On average, it's 50-50 is going to be like female and male, for example. So, you know, you're better off engaging with women, so it's a better product. Otherwise, your product is only going to be targeted for men, and we would say, well, this is not designed properly. So obviously, there's a lot of opportunities.
Oh yeah, and if you look, even if you look at the medical industry, for example, they for years did all their drug testing and stuff on men, right? Because you know, women have a monthly period and their hormones flux and change, and they didn't want to have to deal with all that stuff, right? So they tested a lot of drugs and stuff just on men, and they figured out the dosing requirements on men, and they did this, and then they start, they start prescribing this stuff to women, right? And the dosages are way too high, the hormones affect it differently, and it wasn't until, it's like in the 2000s that the FDA required testing on women in equal amounts of the two, right? Even in car crash tests, right? The test dummies were men. And so they killed a bunch of women and children with the car airbags because they literally exploded on them, right? Because they didn't test on smaller stature people, and that, you know, that's now why kids need to ride in the back seat, right? But they just didn't, you know, it's like you have to look at the population you're serving and use it, right? So we know that in the product space, but somehow in the employee space we lost it.
Back to the top.
We're supposed to be back down now, right? Is that true?
Yeah.
We have a break.
But if anybody has any more questions, I'm happy to chat, so thank you.
Thank you.